Welcome to the Design Vault, a show about the past, present, and future of design. The Design Vault is a conversation hosted by Albert Shum and Tamer Abanami, reflecting on iconic products and ideas from the past and rethinking them from new perspectives.
Welcome to the Design Vault podcast. Albert, how are you and what are we talking about today?
Hey, Tamer. Well, today's episode, we're going to talk about the Nintendo Game Boy. What makes the design iconic? And also, there's a really interesting topic around lateral thinking, which I think the Game Boy really epitomizes.
Right. It's this quote, I think, from the designer where I think it's a big principle for him, lateral thinking with withered technology. And I think in today's episode, we're going to get into that. And so I think when we talk about the story of the Nintendo Game Boy, you can't really tell it without talking about the importance of creating constraints and boundaries for the design. And so, we can start with kind of looking at where this company came from. Nintendo was founded in the late 1800s, and it was a playing card company for many decades.
Yeah, it's such an interesting origin story of.
Right? But then it was a toy company. And then after being a toy company, it became this juggernaut of video games. And so it kind of helps to think about, it was not a tech company. It was a game. It was about games and toys from the get-go.
Yeah, definitely. And also it had such a strong cultural, I want to say adaptation, but it really brought a clarity of like, hey, we make products based on our understanding of the culture, be it the culture of gamers or the culture of Japan. And I feel like that's probably one of the constraints that we don't often consider in design, right? Is culture.
Yeah. It's almost like if you're going to be designing a toy, that's a different mentality than saying, hey, I have a hardware spec and I needed to make a video game platform, right? Those are two different starting points. And I think in the industry, those starting points have both been executed.
Yeah, definitely. And especially the era when Game Boy first came along, you look at what the landscape was and what the technology was even. I think it really speaks to how Nintendo's approach was so different than other companies at that time, or what was known as gaming companies, I guess, or tech companies.
Yeah, and I think to understand the story of the Game Boy, maybe we should start with the story of Genpei Yokoi, who is I would say the lead designer for the Game Boy. He was born in Japan in 1929, studied electrical engineering at the University of Tokyo, and he went to work at Nintendo after graduation. At that time, Nintendo was a playing card company, and Genpei Yokoi's job was maintenance. So he did maintenance, and on the side, he would just, to entertain himself, make gadgets. And there was something that he kind of created that was a little arm that extended with a grip called the Ultra Hand.
The Ultra Hand.
And yeah, for Nintendo nerds probably know what that is. It's made some cameo appearances in video games. And one day, the head of Nintendo visited the plant, and he saw the Ultra Hand and said, we're going to make this. And let's try to make this before Christmas season. And it ended up being a success. And so Genpei went from maintenance to toys, and Nintendo was manufacturing toys. But then later on, he became the leader of Team R&D1, which was the team that developed the first mobile gaming hit for Nintendo. And that was not the Game Boy. It was something called the Game & Watch.
The Game
Have you heard of the Game &
Watch? I've never heard
Game
of this.
& Watch.
Game & Watch.
Okay. So the story goes like this. Genpei Yokoi was on a train late at night, and he saw a Japanese businessman also commuting home, and he was entertaining himself by just playing around with a calculator. And he thought, what if we took this form factor of a calculator and created a game? But of course, it can't just be a game. Maybe it could also tell time. So we'll call it the Game & Watch. And it turns out, I think my first mobile video game when I was a kid was a Game & Watch. It was a game called Parachute. You can look it up. And the Game & Watch...
Is it a watch or is it a game?
No. It was like, imagine a landscape calculator that was small. Uh-huh. It had two buttons. Every game. So
it was a handheld kind of device.
It was a handheld game, yeah with an LCD display. and buttons, and then it could tell time. It could be a clock also. The story goes kind of like this, and this gives you kind of an idea how ideas get started. Genpei Yokoi was pitching this idea to Hiroshi Yamauchi, who was the president of Nintendo, in passing, and he said to him, "Hey, let's continue this conversation if you can drive me to this meeting I have with Sharp."
So he was the driver.
So he became the driver now, and so he's driving he's the head of the company to a meeting, and he pitches the idea. Head of the company goes in, has the meeting with Sharp. A week later, they are back at Sharp with Genpei and pitching this idea. Sharp was one of the largest calculator manufacturers at the time,
right.
so they had the ingredients required to make this.
Right,
Little
so they have
processors,
pieces, right? Like
all the pieces,
CPU,
right? Remember, remember, Nintendo at this time has already made. This is now the early '80s, and so they're transitioning from being a toy company to probably they're in development with the NES system at this point, and they're looking at this option also. And so they create this thing called the Game & Watch, and the Game & Watch becomes a success. Every game is different. Every device has one game on it.
Oh, so it didn't play one game.
Layout.
So it was a dedicated.
It only play one game.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right.
It was a dedicated game for hardware, and it was a massive success. And it sold about 45 million.
Wow.
Or so, which is a lot at that time.
I totally skipped this whole part in my life.
Yeah, I think gaming is weird because people kind of come in and come out of it. I never owned a Game Boy or a Nintendo console.
Right.
But I did have a Game & Watch.
Okay.
And so as I was researching the story, I saw a screen of parachute, and all of a sudden, all this kind of anxiety of getting to the advanced levels of moving this boat around to catch the parachuting folks coming from a helicopter so the sharks wouldn't get to them. It's so simple, but so cool.
And so I think that constrained. It really
and very constrained.
Took advantage of what the technology was enabled and made it.
Yeah, there were only two buttons really for the gameplay, left and right. That was it. And, a display that didn't have a backlight. And, you can look these up, the Game & Watches. They're quite fascinating. So you really can't talk about the Game Boy without talking about the Game & Watch, because as you go into the Game Boy, now this is R&D1, the team that developed Game & Watch. They are the experts of mobile gaming.
Right.
Now.
So and that was considered almost like a mobile game because you could carry it with you, right? It's
yeah.
You don't have to be small. At home in front of a TV to play games.
Yeah, it's like the exact vision of the businessman with the calculator. Right. Now anybody could have one of these things.
Riding the train at night or going to work. Or
lots of battery life. Battery life was many, many hours, right? And so you just can pull this out and entertain yourself. And so that's kind of the story of the Game & Watch. And a lot of things, the Game & Watch became this kind of platform for a lot of developments later, like the D-pad. When they did the Donkey Kong version of the Game & Watch console, they kind of created the D-pad. A lot of time in 1982, a lot of games were joystick. And so D-pad is flush. You can have it be the same as the top surface of the device. It makes it more reliable. So this was and later the Game & Watch had also these clamshell form factors that you'll see later in the DS. So this was really, I think, if you study the Game & Watch family and all the things that came out of it, you'll start seeing a lot of the DNA of Nintendo's mobile gaming. Which brings us to...
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. In terms of, again, reinforcing this idea that products evolve and the learnings evolve. Maybe that's a whole different narrative, that there's these step function of products where the Game Boy just came out of the blue, right? Maybe that's how I remember it, but that.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways it did. In some ways the Game & Watch came out of the blue, right? When that chance meeting, a chance alliance with
But
Sharp.
Seeing someone using a calculator on a train, right? That was the insight, the customer insight, the need.
People spend a lot of time commuting. They need something to mess around with.
Right.
And there were no mobile phones back then. You had books, newspapers, and you had a calculator if you're a businessman. There's only so much calculator stuff you can do to entertain yourself. So now if we kind of think about this idea, this is Genpei Yokoi's philosophy, lateral thinking with technology. And the Game & Watch embodied that. The tech was very simple. The displays were very simple. And that allowed for the fundamentals to get nailed. So these things could have massive battery life, be light, be reliable. You wouldn't need to spend a lot of time getting a new processor up to speed or getting a new board set up. Use things that are off the shelf that have been around for decades. And so that, I think, was the philosophy that they were starting the Game Boy with. And there was a big debate. I believe that Genpei Yokoi was thinking, hey, we're going to take what we learned with the Game & Watch and build a general purpose first-party library device of Nintendo games. They could be 20 or 30 or whatever.
So does that then it could play multiple games, right? So it's more of a...
You could play multiple games, which meant your display had to have pixels or dots on them versus have preset characters and preset things on them. But there was a debate. So we're kind of here in the mid-'80s or mid to late '80s. And one of his underlings was, I think we should have cartridges, just like the NES. I think we should follow in the footsteps of the NES.
So NES was already successful. It was already in market. So they
1983, I think, was when the NES came out.
Right. So this is...
And so it was in the market, right? They had done their Game & Watch. Game & Watch continued, then NES came out. And now there's this debate. And the debate is, hey, should we make this a cartridge-based system? And remember, lateral thinking with their technology, you're kind of relaxing constraints here to be a miniature NES. And that was the big debate. It's going to be complicated. It's going to be hard. And then have to open up to third-party developers to get third-party games. That's going to be even harder. However, he listened and he was won over by the debate. And so they embarked on this project where we're going to make a mobile gaming device with cartridges. And we're going to still try to apply this lateral thinking with their technology philosophy.
Yeah, can you expand more on this idea of the lateral? Well, the wither technology, they're both kind of interesting words, right? They're framing. Like, lateral to me, it's like adjacent, something next to, or you kind of shift right, shift left. And wither means, I guess, existing technology that's kind of, surpassed by new technology. Would that be the right framing?
Yeah. It's almost like wither technology. To me, it means mature and uninteresting.
Matured, right. Yeah, it's like last year's CPU, right? Like,
not even that. We're talking maybe in the case of the Game Boy, over a decade, right? These are CPUs that have been around forever in embedded systems and things like that.
But they're probably very commoditized and low cost.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Well supported, very commoditized. Lots of background on how to program.
Easy to source and reliable.
No bugs. Right. Also, because they're not the most powerful processors, they're going to be much more energy efficient typically. So you solve a bunch of problems right out of the gate.
Right.
Because we both worked on projects where you have to be on the bleeding edge tech spec.
Oh yeah, and I think this perception, not perception, it's actually real, that people want the latest and greatest. It has to be the next gen technology, the next gen processor, the next gen display. Like, it's megapixel. It's like like every year the spec goes up, the speed goes up, right? And that's perception of innovation.
Yeah, and I think, let's just take this kind of conversation where we kind of said earlier, culture, right? If you're a toy maker and you are a cultural force making toys and creating characters, that's a different starting point than if you're a technology company.
Right.
And you're trying to create games and toys, right?
Yeah.
It's if you start from the game, it's different.
Right.
And I think if you look at the history of Nintendo, to this day with the Switch, it is not the most advanced spec, but they have...
Right, it was never about like, our console spec or our Game Boy spec is better than yours. And I don't think they even talk about it much, actually.
No, typically, I think the lateral thinking manifests with there's a twist. The twist is either in the gameplay, the twist is either with the
controller,
there was motion,
the D-pad,
exactly.
The form factor, the
form factor, and I think it makes them almost like different. They always kind of zag when everybody's going one direction. They have this concept, and so there are 3 devices that came out within a year of each other. Just gives you the example, right?
Portable gaming,
Game Boy, Atari Lynx, and Sega Game Gear.
Oh, Sega! Actually, I had that one.
And so the Sega Game Gear, I think, was $150. The Atari Lynx was $180, I think. and the Nintendo Game Boy was, I think, $90
Wow.
at launch. So back to with their technology, that also your bill of materials is extremely reduced. You're going to be selling. You sold a lot more. If you look at these across these three devices, I think the Game Boy had something like 20 hours of battery life. The others had 4. Right, and you're using AA's or AAA's or whatever, so you're not recharging.
Yeah.
And so that makes it a little bit more, expensive.
I also remember it was such a robust design. It was so iconic. Like you could drop it and it's just, it's like as a kid, like things fall, right? You kind of lose it in your hands and you drop it from your backpack and it would still work.
100%. And so we can go on and on about how the examples of Wither Tech with creative technology.
But why maybe this is the tougher question, Thomas. Why do other companies don't take the similar approach? Is it business is viable? Is that a cultural thing? Is it something that you have to shift almost like expectations, right, with your customers? Like I feel like that's really back to constraints.
Yeah. For example, in this case, you have vertical integration for the most part. You control the hardware and the software. You control the titles and the gaming device. And you know that most of the catalog is going to come from you. And so their philosophy was centered on the belief that the gaming system was primarily determined by the quality of the games. They had
the gameplay, gameplay itself.
Yeah, the games and the gameplay itself are what makes everything
right.
That's the basis. And coming from a toy manufacturer, I could see that philosophy. It comes back to that where they come from and what their DNA is. And I think back to, it depends on your orientation. If you are a tech company, it is much more easier to be, the siren call of new tech. It's easier to be seduced by that.
Well, also I think it's easy to back to like when it's maybe this is a personal anecdote and gets me in trouble a bit, but like we tend to pitch ideas as, especially to the leadership team, to executive, we want to pitch the vision, like where we can go. Like, wow, this is whole new thing called spatial computing, the metaverse, the AR, VR, mixed reality, and it's going to be amazing. And you kind of generate, designers, and we're great at kind of building that story and actually be able to kind of show the potential and these aspirational scenarios and customer journeys that I think I'm as guilty as anyone to work on that. But like when Genpei pitched it to his CEO, I'm sure it was a very different, like he wasn't talking about like, wow, I have this vision for this new thing for gaming and we're going to bring mobility to gaming and we're going to create the next gen platform that will allow us to create a SaaS service of games that in the cloud. And like, I feel like they're much more back to that constraint. Like, hey, wow, if you're on a train and you have 5 minutes, you want to play a game and really enjoy that moment and be constrained about that, you can actually create a really compelling and innovative product.
Yeah, and I think, depending on the size of the company and its aspirations, you might have a lot of friction against an idea that's not big enough. And so, I've seen pitches where like, this is amazing. It's not a big enough idea because I'm a platform company and I need something bigger, right?
Right.
And
or
so
we're not a hardware company and
right.
we can't do that because we need partners, right?
Yeah, totally. And so it is complicated, but maybe I can dive into specific examples of how the Game Boy made these trade-offs on the hardware. Yeah. I mentioned other devices. They didn't feel the need to be a color display. So they actually had, I think it's 4 shades of gray. I think it's 160 pixels across or 160 dots across and 148. I forget the dimensions, but 148 by 160. Something like that.
Right. I remember,
and it's 4 shades.
The Sega Game Gear was actually color.
Yeah, and the Atari Lynx was color.
But as we know, it consumes more power. It's more expensive.
Battery life.
It requires bigger processor. It requires more battery. It becomes
a bigger device.
Yeah, it becomes bigger and less portable, less robust.
Right.
Like I think that probably, I'm sure, in the presentation and meeting, like, wow, we would be the first company with a color display and show like how many pixels and 8-bit color.
Right. And this display did not have a backlight. either.
Oh, I
right. So
forgot
now
that.
you have 4 shades of gray. There's no backlight. So you have to play someplace
No,
where
I remember
there's
there was an
reflection.
accessory you could buy with a little light that you
Yeah.
clip on top.
Yeah.
So you could play
Yeah.
the Game Boy.
I know people who don't know what the Game Boys are hearing this and their jaws are on the floor probably. But remember our friends at Sharp, the earlier Game & Watch, they also ended up supplying the CPU and the LCD for the Game Boy. So you see a lot of the kind of how, a lot of these business dynamics in Japan. You have these big companies that can supply components. And so I think originally other companies were running and ended up working out to be Sharp. And so you have this CPU that is very dated and very low cost. You have this LCD, which is very low cost again. And those are always those two starting points with a mobile device, sorry. It's always like, what's the processor, what's the screen? So you couldn't pick a lower spec compared to the other ones. And so this is what ended up being the device. And we talked about the display, talked about the processor, but what's interesting to me is what makes it iconic. And I think, Albert, you could maybe paint the picture for us.
Similar to your other conversation on iconic product, it's the one is that first read, and I think it was it was in the era of industrial design, which I find really interesting. Like because everything was still kind of using 2D tools, so it was laid out in front views, side views, and you kind of look at the way it's constructed, even the housing, there's a top and a bottom. It's very simple in some ways, the construction. But you start seeing like industrial designers start playing around with like angles, even the asymmetrical corner. Like if you look at the design, take a look at the picture, like, the bottom right corner was rounded, whereas the other one was all the other corners had different radius or less radius, was sharper. And so there was definitely thought and that about the details. I think that's the second part about iconic design is the attention to all those details. And really trying to harmonize that.
Yeah, and it also had a portrait orientation, much like a candy bar phone or a calculator that was simple relative to what was coming out at the time.
Yeah,
which was
I'm curious.
two-handed devices.
Actually, this is a big debate on design teams, on UX teams, and hardware teams when they collaborate. The screen size. I remember like we had like all these debates, right? Because back to constraints. Once you have a fixed set of pixels and screen size, your game or UX team has to work within that constraint. So you have to relay out everything appropriately, or lay it out appropriately, not relay out. But I'm sure at that time you have to rethink your game when a TV aspect ratio, right, back then was probably, it's not even 69, maybe 4:3, landscape orientated. And now if you ask a game designer, hey, we're going to go portrait because we think there's a better orientation on a handheld, I'm sure that the team is like, what? We have to redesign our game or we have to relay it out, which is a lot of work.
Yeah, no. I mean, back to the screen spec and the processor spec and these kind of big shift to now I have to host cartridges in third-party games. The people working on it called it, I think, the doomed project.
Oh,
I don't know what the word was.
I call it a triple threat problem, meaning it's not a basketball terminology. It's mostly like in a design terminology, triple threat is hardware, software, and service. Trying to deliver all that in one product at launch, that is so hard to do. And most companies aren't able to execute that level. 100%. Many have tried.
But they pulled it out. And I think the embrace of those constraints helped make it iconic. Back to the portrait display. If they just threw everything and the kitchen sink at it, it would probably look like the Game Gear and the Lynx, because they had to stretch to be horizontal. They wanted to show off the games in landscape, and then it just grew and grew. But I think back to this, it's a rectangle that is in a portrait orientation, has a D-pad that's black, has an A and B button in red, almost a 45. And it's just nothing else looked like it, and nothing else looks like it.
Yeah. And the sound, right? The speaker grill. And again, this is before headphones, before Bluetooth, before like gaming without sound is actually half the experience. And the music, there's actually this whole subgenre of music and history of game music. I feel like that is just as like iconic, the sound it makes, and really celebrating that, the sound coming out of the Game Boy.
And so we kind of go into the timeline of Nintendo. We talked about the Game & Watch. It sold about 40 million, 44 million. That was 1980. The NES, which was a home system that would hook up to a TV, was a massive success in 1983. It sold about 62 million. The Game Boy comes out in 1989 in Japan and 1990 in the United States, and it sells about 120 million.
Wow, so it was a massive success then.
Massive success. Just to put that in perspective, the Nintendo DS sold 150 million or so, and the Nintendo Switch is about 150 also. So these are big numbers. But let's talk kind of on the timeline. The Game Boy is 1989 and a bunch of its variants. Then the Super NES comes out. And then Genpei's next project after the Game Boy and its descendants was something called the Virtual Boy. And the Virtual Boy was essentially a kind of mini VR headset with a controller, and it came out in 1995. But, how can the Virtual Boy be designed by the same folks and the same design that embrace the constraints with the technology, and then they suddenly do the Virtual Boy? Did they still embrace constraints and try to do the VR thing as a twist, or did they fall into a trap of pursuing the latest and greatest?
Yeah, I think there's a Star Wars quote here. There's a trap. It's no, I do think it is the opposite of lateral thinking, and not opposite. That's maybe too harsh, but I think there was probably a lot of pressure to outdo, and again, we all face this in our work and in our career. Like when you have a massive success, it's like being in a band even, or any creative endeavor. You're always trying to think about, hey, what's next? And how do you continue to push both creatively, but also thinking about new opportunities, right? To explore. And I think, and you got to remember, like this, this is the 90s, right? I think VR was just, the concept of VR was, and we all think like, oh, the metaverse VR is just happening now. No, but it's actually, it was before then, like this concept of in 95, I think that's when, movies like, I forgot when the first Matrix came out, but like even books, right? This idea of cyberpunk, like Snow Crash, like a lot of the Neuromancer, like it was in the 90s. So there was this enamor about virtual reality. And I'm sure Nintendo thought like gaming, hey, this is the next wave. And creating these immersive experiences. Wow. That would be such an amazing opportunity. But this is the but part, right? Maybe it lost its way a bit because there was not a strong customer insight. Back to that train story of seeing someone on a train, like you wouldn't take the Virtual Boy on a train. Actually, the way it worked, and I still remember demo, I never could afford it, but it was actually, you had to place it on a desk, even though it was a portable game, I guess. But you had it had a little stand, and you have to lean into it and try to wear it while it's because it was so heavy that you couldn't actually put it on your head. So you had to lean it onto a desk and try to experience it and play a game. So it was so anti-constraint in a sense of it was trying to do too much almost. And which, again, back to, if you try to do too much, you're most likely not doing any one thing really well. And I think that's probably one of the lessons of why lateral thinking and withering technology is it's so important.
Yeah, I think it's almost like there's two buckets of a bunch of lateral thinking stuff and a bunch of wither technology stuff, and they picked the wrong things from the wrong buckets, I think, in this one. Because if you look at the display tech, it was pretty simple. I think it was one color.
I think it was red.
It was just red, right? And you had parallax, and that was trying to be the lateral.
Yeah,
we're going to do parallax,
which also,
but in order to pull off parallax,
the downside of parallax.
Yeah, and so I think the fundamentals couldn't add up here. But after that, I think that was considered a failure, and Genpei left Nintendo. However, even though Genpei left Nintendo, I would say the DNA that came with the Game Boy and the Game & Watch is what lives on today in everything Nintendo does. If you look at the Nintendo DS, it looks like a straight descendant of a lot of the Game & Watch concepts. You look at the Switch.
Yeah, I would say Switch
has a lot of that DNA.
Yeah. The innovation, the constraint, the kind of rethinking the user experience, right? What is portable gaming? And the idea that you could play against each other and not be on a network. Yeah, so I feel like there's some really great lessons of lateral thinking and withering technology from Game Boy, but also applied to so many other product making areas in the way we design and the way we create, and probably more importantly, in the way we pitch ideas. We pitch ideas without constraints, and that's a big danger, I feel like, sometimes.
So what would you say was the impact of the Game Boy in the bigger picture?
On the gaming side, and really more on an individual kind of consumer and user side, it opened up this whole area of making gaming more accessible to everyone. And I don't have the stats, but I'm sure we can look it up. But like, I felt like Game Boy is one of the, and actually Nintendo was one of the key gaming companies that look at gaming as accessible to everyone, regardless of age, gender, background, and even the games themselves, right? Like Zelda or Mario, they're not like, oh, that's a very aggressive, violent, like kind of games that tends to be more tailored towards male dominant gaming experiences. I think it's Nintendo should be really recognized for that, how they make gaming more accessible to everyone.
Yeah, and I think it's that lives on in the franchises that are created. The Mario, Zelda, Pokemon Red and Blue was released on the Game Boy in '96, and it led to the animated series and movies and trading cards and more. Right. I think this was an interesting conversation because really, this is a product that embodies constraints, but also creativity. And we talked about Nintendo's transition from being a card maker, to playing cards, to toys, to video games. We talked about the Game & Watch and how that was the genesis of the mobile gaming there, and how the idea of lateral thinking with the technology was made real. The development of the Icon, the Game Boy, came after that. We talked about how this legacy and philosophy continues to this day. And we talked about how embracing and celebrating constraints in the creation of breakthrough products is something that you can wield. And with that wraps up another episode of Design Vault. We'd love to learn from you and hear from you. Maybe you can tell us how you might have applied lateral thinking with extreme constraints. We'd also love to hear from you in general. Reach out anytime with your thoughts, questions, and ideas at the links in the show notes. And thanks so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed the show, please consider subscribing and leaving a rating or review. It really helps us out. And with that, Albert, thank you for your time, and thanks, everybody.
Yeah, let's keep making awesome products.
Thank you for listening. The Design Vault is brought to you by hosts Albert Shum and Thamer Abanami, and is produced and edited by Romina Hakim, Tonio Telles, and Poonam Patel, with music by Red Lips Media, brand design by Rafael Poloni. Join the conversation on social media at the Design Vault Podcast on Instagram. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any organizations they represent.